Hello and welcome to Capital Hill. I'm Lyndall Curtis. The state and territory treasurers were in town today for what turned out to be a relatively brief meeting with their federal counterpart. The coalition treasurers from 4 states were unhappy with the amount of information being provided to them by Wayne Swan. Elsewhere in Canberra, the Public Service announced it was cutting more jobs, while in Sydney, the ACTU announced it was considering cutting ties with the troubled Health Services Union. Joining me to discuss the day are Labor MP Nick Champion and Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer. Welcome to you both.
Hi Lyndall, hi Nick.
Good afternoon.
First, we'll hear what the treasurers had to say when they were in town for their meeting today.
This is an opportunity to spend 6 or 7 hours going across detail. But you can't go across detail that isn't presented to the meeting. So with respect to the Commonwealth Grants Commission and the Greiner and Brumby's committee review, we spent our short amount of time there arguing about when the states should get the interim report, which the Commonwealth Government have now got, rather than sitting around with the interim report, which could have been posted to us yesterday, and talking through it.
Today we were saying we want to work constructively with the federal government, but we need something to work with. And so we can't make bricks without straw, and at the moment we're just getting fresh air at the moment. So I think that's a common aim of all the states, and I know it was also an issue not just of the Conservative states, but it was also raised by South Australia, by Tasmania and others.
The federal government can carry on and say that they want to digest these reports. Well, I guess we can all digest the reports at the same time. We just want those reports released to the states so we can start working on them.
In that room there are divergent views. You won't get all treasurers agreeing on the outcomes of these independent processes. It's never been any different and it won't be any different in the future.
Now, there were 2 issues that the treasurers were discussing. One was the review into the carve-up of the goods and services tax. The other was the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Nick, on the question of the review of the GST carve-up, Wayne Swan has an interim report. Shouldn't he release that to the states for them to have a look at, to be able to have a discussion about what it's found?
Well, it sounded to me a lot like the states were playing the good old-fashioned blame game, which of course we've tried to avoid over the last few years, but it seems to have returned to Canberra. It seems to me that the federal government's got a right to consider reports that have just been handed to it before we hand them on to states. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to do, to be able to digest a report that you've just received. It's understandable that Liberal state treasurers should try and play the blame game, given that they're now grappling with the reality that governments around the world are grappling with, that is falling revenues as a result of international growth falling. These are not just problems for state and federal governments, they're problems for governments around the world, and they're problems that treasurers have had to grapple with around the world. So even though Australia's travelling much better than most, much better than Europe, much better than the United States, and much better than just about any other industrialised country, treasurers of all shapes and sizes and of all political colours and hues have to grapple with, you know, some pretty tough economic circumstances in terms of revenue. I think they should stop playing the blame game and start playing a constructive game around how we carve up revenue and around, in particular, the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Kelly, this is only an interim report that Wayne Swan has received from the review of the GST carve-up. Why isn't it right to wait until the full report's out to put that before the state treasurers?
Well, Nick Lyndall talks about the blame game, and I think it's curious that he would use that expression given that there was a unity ticket today of both Labor and Liberal treasurers who all wanted to receive access to these reports. Wayne Swan squibbed it again. He came up with the latest lot of excuses as to why he couldn't share information. All of these state treasurers do want to work constructively with the Commonwealth, but they are being denied this information, just like they're denied information in so many other forums. This government needs to be honest with the Australian people. It needs to be honest with these state treasurers. It needs to provide them with the information on which they can make decisions.
But it's only an interim report. It's not the final report.
Well, all of this information is going to be useful if there is to be a constructive discussion. And of course, Wayne Swan has squibbed it again. He has to be the worst treasurer this country has ever seen. And all of the state treasurers, I think, can agree on that. We have got a real challenge ahead of us in the upcoming budget. And all of these state treasurers, particularly the recent state treasurers who have inherited these economies from their previous Labor counterparts, have got huge black holes in which to fill. Now, they can only do that if they have access to information on which to start making decisions in their state's interest and also in the national interest.
Nick, the other issue that the Treasurers were supposed to be talking about was the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, this is a bipartisan effort to get this scheme up and running. Isn't there a greater case for the Commonwealth, while it's in the midst of preparing a budget, to provide all the information it has to state treasurers to try and get this scheme, which federal Labor regards as a significant reform, up and running?
Well, I think the most important thing is that we do this reform, which is a long-awaited reform from people with disabilities and their families. It's been a big concern now for decades, and we're the first government to do anything meaningful, I think, in this area. But it's important that we, take our time, that we construct the system well, and that we construct it appropriately. I don't think anybody wants us going off half-cocked, or I don't think anybody wants us, constructing a system that won't stand the test of time. So I think that's important. It's a very important priority for this government. It's one that we've put on the public policy frontier after years of neglect. But I think we need to do it in a systematic and considered way.
Kelly, there already is a committee of COAG, a select council of COAG, made up of treasurers and disability ministers. Isn't that forum that already exists the right place to be discussing the nuts and bolts of the NDIS?
Well, the NDIS has to be paid for, and the state treasurers are quite rightly asking the question, what is it that each state is going to have to put up in order to contribute to the National Disability Insurance Scheme? We all agree that this is a very important scheme, and it's a scheme that needs to be implemented. But it's absolutely not true, as Nick has suggested, that this government has actually done anything about it at all. In fact, far from it, it has made it much worse. We only need to look at the fact that already we are paying around about $6 billion in interest payments alone on the government's debt, $6 billion of which, of course, could be spent on a National Disability Insurance Scheme. The Productivity Commission itself said that this was around about the amount of money that was needed in order to properly implement this scheme. So the government's talk is very cheap. The fact that the government is not prepared to talk to the state treasurers about this scheme indicates that they are all talk and no action.
We might move on. Others may be assuming it, but the Federal Labor MP, Craig Thomson, doesn't know if he's one of the people named in a Fair Work Australia investigation into the activities of the Health Services Union. Here's what he had to say this morning.
Look, we know nothing more than what you know. We found out about this on Twitter. We've had no notification from Fair Work Australia. We'll look at it, we'll cooperate with people in relation to what's there, but really we just have no further information whatsoever, and we'll just have to deal with it. But it is incredibly frustrating that after 4 years it appears it's been sent to someone else to do exactly what Fair Work was meant to do for the last 4 years. So we just have to deal with it.
Now, there are a few other developments on this story today. The Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, who's received Fair Work Australia's report, has said the material is not a brief of evidence, although it will examine the material it's been sent. The ACTU announced it's having a special meeting tomorrow to consider suspending the HSU from the ACTU, a move which has not impressed HSU officials. And a Senate Select Committee has asked Fair Work Australia for a copy of the report. Nick Champion, should this report be made public?
Well, look, I think the principles that we should operate here under is basically, first of all, people have the presumption of innocence. The second principle is that investigative bodies which are separated and at arm's length from the political system should be allowed to investigate unimpeded by the political system or by politicians, and that we should let them get on and do their work. And that really should be the end of the matter as terms of politics. I think we should just leave the investigative bodies to do their work and await the outcome.
Kelly, there's been a lot of talk about Craig Thomson throughout this matter, but questions of guilt or innocence aren't they matters for the courts to determine, and aren't we a long way away from that?
Well, look, on one thing that Nick just said, I do agree, which is about the presumption of innocence. However, that's not to say that we should be ignorant as to what is in this report. This is a taxpayer-funded report. It should be immediately released to the public so we all understand what it is that Fair Work Australia has been doing for the last 3 and a bit years. This investigation has been going on for 4 years. The report, as we understand it, has taken them over 3 years in which to write it. Taxpayers do have a right to know exactly what's in it, just as they did in Queensland when you had the Fitzgerald inquiry, which was a very serious inquiry into corruption into Queensland, when in fact that report that had very sensitive material was in fact released to the public. In a similar way, we ought to know exactly what is in this report, and it really behoves belief that the government is not pressing Fair Work Australia to make this report public. And one can only ask the question, why? Again, the Julia Gillard has not said anything other than she has full confidence in Craig Thomson. Given why she has full confidence in Craig Thomson when in fact we are all ignorant as to what is in this report, again, leaves many questions unanswered. And I think it's very important that the Australian public, just as the people who have contributed to the funds of the HSU, have a right to know exactly what has gone on.
Given that this matter is before the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, given there are also police investigations, isn't there the prospect, though, publicly releasing the report now could jeopardise the other investigations that are underway?
Well, I only point to the precedent that I just mentioned before with the Fitzgerald inquiry and the public release of that information. But the Fitzgerald inquiry was a differently constructed inquiry, wasn't it? It was effectively a judicial inquiry. It was a very, very serious inquiry. Now, this inquiry has been going on for more than 3 years, as I just said. The report has been conducted. Nick was talking before about allowing people to get on and conduct the appropriate inquiries through appropriate channels. We've already seen Fair Work frustrate police investigations. This leads us to be very concerned about whether, in fact, the proper inquiry has taken place at the appropriate times, Nick, which is why we ask the simple question, why is it that this report cannot be released? Nick, would it be better for the Labor Party to have this matter over and done with, to have the investigations finished and to know publicly exactly what the allegations are?
Well, what it would be better is if politicians, Liberal Party politicians in particular, just backed off and let the investigative bodies do their job. If you believe in the presumption of innocence and you believe in independent investigations and appropriately independent investigations, then you can't, you can't question the presumption of innocence, and you can't, hurry up investigations. That's completely inappropriate to do so. And I just find the kind of lip service that's paid by the Liberal Party to these very, very important legal principles which have stood the test of time, not just in our own country, but in Britain and the UK, which are part of our British heritage, very important principles. They should be honoured, not just, they should be honoured, as important principles and divorced from people's short-term political interests.
And I'm sorry, that's where we'll have to leave it. Nick Champion and Kelly O'Dwyer, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndall. Thanks, Nick.
And thank you for joining Capital Hill today. Please be with us at the same time tomorrow.